In this video, we're going to look at some continued ways to use insert mesh brushes. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is controlling the depth of our insert mesh brush, how far that sticks out from the surface, being able to control that. And then we'll take a look at the Z plugin for Decimation Master to kind of reduce our poly count of the models that we're using for insert mesh brushes. Then we're also going to take a look at how we can use insert mesh brushes with a model that's in Dynamesh mode, so we can add or subtract away from geometry. And then the last thing we're going to take a look at is how we can build a three-part model that can be used as an insert mesh brush that can be turned into one of these curves or tubes. It's actually going to be a three-part model that gets pushed down into one model and has polygroups, and with those polygroups it defines out these different curves. Alright, so the first thing we'll take a look at is controlling the depth information for an insert mesh brush. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit the comma key and load up one of my insert mesh brushes. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pick, I think this one's got enough information that'll kind of make this a little more apparent for what's going on. So if we go here on the back and we click and we drag out, this brush is a model that has a little bit of a stem at the bottom of it. So what if we're not too happy with how that thing is being inserted into the model? We can control that through going to the brush setting. I'm going to dock that over here, and then there's a depth setting within here that will allow us to push this either up, and I'm going to make my brush size a little bit smaller, and if we click and drag out, you can see it's going to push it out in the surface a little bit more on the brush. Now if we want to embed this directly into the surface, we could do that through this like this, or if we want to push it down even further, we can click and drag out, and you can see how it's going to push that down in there. So this depth slider has quite a bit of an effect over how the insert mesh brushes are put into this new model that we see here. So it's going to be up to you to kind of determine the depth of this thing, and this information actually gets saved out with the brush, so it will retain that information. So I'm going to hit undo for that to get the model back on here. So the next thing we'll take a look at is using the Z plugin Decimation Master to reduce the overall poly count of some of these insert mesh brushes, because they can be pretty heavy if you're not careful about that. So I'm also going to show you how to take any insert mesh brushes and then get the models out of that. So I'm going to click over to just a plain 3D. So I'm going to take this 3D primitive and turn it into a real model by hitting Make Polymesh 3D. I'm just going to go ahead and click on that, and you should say this new version here, Polymesh 3D, plain 3D here. If we turn on the polyframe, we can see the poly count for this, and if we go to geometry, I want to get it down even lower, so I'm going to use this Reconstruct Subdivision, and it's going to, instead of like adding a subdivision, it's going to reconstruct the lower subdivisions, and we can keep pushing that down until I just have a quad like this that has this center point, because I'm going to use that to click and drag out to pull our models out on. So the next thing I'm going to do is go to the deformation, and then I'm going to go to rotate, and I'm going to rotate on X. Oops, I accidentally hit that. Click on X and turn off Z, and you can see if we rotate this, we could rotate it down. We want to rotate it down 90 degrees, so I'm just going to take my mouse and click on here once, and I can type in 90, and it's going to give me a 90-degree rotation. So now I've got this flat plane, and you can see if we use these mesh insert brushes, we could actually take this. I can make my brush size a certain size. Let's just go to the top here, and I'll try to make my brush a consistent size like this. Okay, so now if I click and drag out, you see how it's snapping to that point. It's going to click and drag out. It's also telling me that if I want to use insert mesh brushes, I can't have subdivision levels, so I forgot to delete those. So we can just get delete higher, and now we're ready to go. Go ahead and click that out, and if I hold down Control, I can make sure that all these brushes that I drag out are the correct size. So I can get rid of this here, the mask on that. So I could hit undo to get back to where it's masked, and we've looked at earlier videos how we can split this thing off. So we've got a subtool and we can say split, and we're using these insert mesh brushes. You could say split unmasked points, and you can see now we've got that model and we've got them separated out. So we've taken an insert mesh brush and we've really turned it into an actual model that we can use as a subtool. So where this comes in handy, obviously any of the insert mesh brushes we can do this process with. If I go ahead and click this and delete this real quick, we'll get back to our quad. So I'll tap the comma key and I'll go back to some insert mesh brushes that I know have multiple models within inside of that insert mesh brush. So I'm going to click here, and we looked at the earlier video. If we tap M, it's going to pull up this entire library for us of different brushes. So I can go to the first one and go ahead and click and drag out like this. And if we hold on Control, we looked at an earlier video that this constrains the brush size to the size of our brush that we have set by tapping S. I'm going to hit undo again, but this time we're going to hold down Shift. If we hold down Shift, you can see it's going to constrain the rotation of this, and if we hold down Shift and drag straight up and down like this, it's going to force it to go straight up and down. And then if we add Control to that, it forces the size to be the size of our brush. So we looked at the earlier video where we can go to the subtool section and we can actually split this off, and we can say split unmasked points. If we turn the polyframe off, we can see that this background has been masked, and then the model is not masked for the insert mesh brush that's been drawn out. That's just a cool functionality that ZBrush has added for this. So they've actually set this up to where you can just drag out an insert mesh brush, then push this button here, and it'll split or separate those into two separate models at that point. So once this has been split off like this, I'm just going to use the solo button on here to isolate the subtool that I have selected. That way I can just keep splitting these pieces off and I don't have to worry about them, and I can go to the next brush in my insert mesh brush library. So I just tap M, go to the next one, and then I'm going to draw this out and hold down Control as I drag out like this, and then go ahead and use that split unmasked points to get the next piece over. I can turn solo off and I can start to take a look at the different models that are being drawn on here. So I was going to go through real quickly and get all those separated out. Alright, now that we have all the meshes separated out and they're individual subtools at this point, we can take that Polymesh 3D for the plane and just hit delete in subtools to get rid of it, and now we're just left with our models. Now at this point we can start to decimate the models and get their poly counts a lot lower than what we currently see. So I'm going to go under Z plugin and then go ahead and click this and dock this section over here. And I'm going to open up the area called Decimation Master. So Decimation Master is going to take a look at the poly count, analyze the model, and figure out a way that it can reduce the polys but still hold the shape. So we could say preprocess current, which would be the current subtool that we're looking at right here under subtool, or we could say preprocess all. So we're going to click the preprocess all. If we had UVs on this, we could tell it to keep the UVs, or if you needed to do something specific and freeze the border edges and not change that vert count along the borders, you could hold these two buttons, but you would have to push those before you start. We're not worried about either one of those, so we'll leave it alone. So we're going to say preprocess all. Go ahead and click that, and it'll go through and start to analyze this. Now, it is giving me an error that my subtools have the same name. So I just went through into the subtools section and took a look at my subtools and gave them all a unique name. It says that they have to be at least 2 characters long, and it can't be start off with a number. So I just named it AA, BB, CC, and so on until I've got all the names kind of different like that. And then now at that point, we'll go ahead and go back up to the Decimation Master and then say preprocess all. and run that. And it's going to run through each one of these shapes and analyze them. And when it gets done, we'll be able to start to decimate these models, and we'll start to be able to reduce their poly count. Now there's two different methods for how we can reduce the poly count. We can do it by a percentage. So if you look at the, like this is the 100% of the poly count, what it originally starts off as, and if we want to drop it down, we keep dropping it down percentage wise. So if we drop it down to like 50%, then the poly count drops to 50% of what it originally started off with. If we keep going even further, we can go to something like 30% or so. The other way is to say a specific number of polys. So this is in thousands. So if you put 1, it'll make the model, it'll try to attempt to make the model 1,000 polys. If you do 2, 2,000. If you do 14, it's going to be 14,000 polys. So just something to keep in mind. I think I'll put the percentage up somewhere around 30% because these models are pretty clean to start off with. If you have a really dense model that is like a Dynamesh model, sometimes I can get away with dropping this down to 12% of the total, and that might start off with a model that was maybe a couple million polygons or so. So that really helps reduce that amount of polys. But if you do start off with something pretty clean like this, you're going to want to make sure that you're not decimating it too much. I'll show you what that looks like. So we can drop that down to 12% like I was talking about and say decimate current. So we could either decimate the current subtool that we see that we're selected on, and we can do them one at a time, which we will do, or you can do the decimate all, which if you know that these settings work well, you can run it and say decimate all, and it's going to run it on all the pieces. You can only do decimate all if you've done the pre-process all. So everything's been processed and it's got those calculations kind of figured out for you. So now I'll just say decimate current, and we'll drop that down, and I'll turn the polyframe off, and you can see it's tore up the model quite a bit. So turn that polyframe back on. You can at any point change these values and then retry this decimate current. So you can see now it's going to show you at 30% what the model looks like, and then maybe I need to pump that up to maybe 40% and decimate that. And if I turn the polyframe off, that looks pretty good for that number. So we could go to the next subtool down. We could just click this here, or the hotkeys for that is you can do up arrow or down arrow. So knowing that, I could just stay within this decimation area, turn on my polyframe so I can see what things look like, and say decimate current. And if I'm happy with that poly reduction there, then I can just click the down arrow and go to the next one and say decimate current. And it looks a little rough for that one. I'll put that at 50 and decimate, and I think that looks a little bit better. So I'll drop this one down and say decimate current, keep going down and keep going. That looks good. And keep going on these models until I have them all complete. And I can turn off solo. We can take a look at it then. So basically we have all these things with the new poly count, and now I could just hit B for my brushes and then say create insert multi-mesh. Make sure it's the multi-mesh and not insert mesh. Insert mesh is just going to be one insert mesh model. This one's going to be the multi-mesh that builds up that tray we're looking for. So I might suggest to you that you have two different versions. One's a high-res version that's not decimated and it looks really good and holds up really close, and then maybe you've got some of these things that you're using and you're just looking at them from kind of far away like this, and you're not necessarily concerned about being able to get like super close to it. Then you've got a low-res version that you could save out this way. Then you can kind of determine what's the best use of your poly count for the amount of detailing that you're putting in your model. Because if these models are too heavy, you can imagine if you add a couple copies of these and they're 60,000 polys, only a few copies is really going to start pumping up your polygon count that you have on your model. So just some things to consider and take into account when you're using these brushes. The next part that we're going to take a look at is how to use insert mesh brushes with the Dynamesh model that we have here, and how we can either add to the model or subtract from the model depending on what those shapes are. So if we turn on the polyframe, you saw in the earlier parts of the video when I was building this head that I actually used a insert sphere. So I tap B and then I, and I used an insert sphere to create the eye. So I just click and drag out, and we've got this new shape that we can move around on the surface of the model, like this. Like if we insert, we've got that. And then if we re-dynamesh this model, we've got groups turned on. So groups is actually going to hold these different polygroups and keep them separate so they don't join together. But if we wanted to have this actually be incorporated into the model, we could turn groups off, and then we could hold down Control and then remesh by holding down Control and dragging it in the open viewport, and it'll remesh that model again. Now that we turn the groups off, it will retain the polygroup information, but it's actually taken those models and it's actually made a one-piece model out of it. So we still have the polygroup information from that, but you can see, like for the spheres that we had in the eyes, we lost that is actually like a separate model that's kind of being retained in one model like this with the polygroups. So I can hit undo. If I want to preserve those eyes and don't want to have to ever worry about it, we've looked quite a few different times, even in this video, about going to subtools and then saying split, and we could say group split. So we could group split those, and then the eyes become something separate. We can give it a name, rename it eyes, and then this will remain our head that we see here. Something else, if we turn off solo, we can look at everything all together. If we hold down shift, it will hide everything, turn off all these visible icons. And if we want to just see another model with that, we can turn on the visibility of that, so we can kind of isolate and show just specific models that we want to work with. That can help speed up things too when you get a lot of dense models on the screen at the same time. And if you want to bring everything back, you just hold on shift and then click on that again, and it'll bring back everything. And then you can hold on shift and click that, and it'll hide everything, and you can just turn on those individual pieces. So now that we have our models separated out and we have these eyes separate, we don't have to really worry about messing those up anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and click and draw out on this, on the model, with our Dynamesh sphere. With our insert mesh sphere, we're going to go ahead and turn off the groups on this, and then we'll hold down Control, drag in the open viewport, and then hold down Control and drag in the open viewport again to go ahead and do the Dynamesh part. So once it runs through, you can see this sphere is a little bit low res, and it does retain that kind of look. You could just hold down shift and smooth out some of the results on that. So that's kind of cool. So you could hit undo, and I can go back to the model before we did the Dynamesh section, and we could just put it on 4, and since this is masked out, we could click and drag this out, and if you wanted to turn them into you know, shapes like a horn or something like that, it would be pretty easy for you to click and drag this thing around. So you can just think of the sphere as a new piece of geometry for you to start kind of playing around with shape-wise. So we can just click and drag this thing out. So I'm going to hold down Control and then get rid of the mask, hold down Control again, and then remesh, and that should become part of the model at that point. So after we run this, let's take a look at real quick doing a negative insert mesh brush. So we looked at the positive, so we can tap B and then tap I for insert, and we could use a sphere, and then instead of us drawing out this thing just from the surface, we'll hold down Alt and we'll do a negative shape. And you can see the visibility of this is quite a bit different. They've put it in this mode to where you can kind of see through the model like that. If you wanted to actually see the entire model, you can go to Display Properties and you can turn on Double, and you would see things in the normal mode that you might be used to. It's just up to you which way you want to see. I think they've done this so you can kind of see through the model and see exactly where it's going to start kind of cutting into, and also to just kind of alert you to the fact that you are doing a negative instead of a positive. So you could squish this thing around and tweak the shape on this as well, just like you could the other shape, and we could turn on Double and kind of see exactly what we're going to get. I don't want that to run into that line there. And so now when we hold down control and get rid of our mask, and then hold down control and drag again to remesh. It's going to look at this and give us a negative for this, so it's going to carve out a hole for us. So that can come in quite handy as well when you're trying to really push your sculpt. It really gives you this ability at that point to use some of the insert brushes, just as adding like new blocks of clay that are very specific shapes for cylinders and cubes. And the thing is, it doesn't really matter. You can use any brush that you want, so you can get pretty complex with the shapes that you're inserting into the mesh or cutting away from it. The last thing we're going to look at is how to set up an insert mesh brush to do really cool shapes like these chords that you see coming out of the back here, like this. All right, so I'm going to switch over to a model real quick and show you how this is kind of built up. So currently we have a three-piece model. We've got a model that is the top section, a model that is the mid section, and a model that is the bottom section. And they all snap together vert-wise, so everything matches up with the topology that you see here. And so basically when we draw out this curve on the screen, we've got the bottom might start at the start of the curve, and then it duplicates this midsection however many times it needs to grow along the curve, and at the end of the curve it puts maybe the top or the bottom. I'm not sure exactly which direction it flows. I do think it is that direction, but you will have a top and you will have a bottom, and then the midsection gets repeated over and over again. I'm going to look over inside of Maya real quick. And so this is the model that was built inside of Maya. You see it's the same exact geometry, but I just want to point out that all these things line up vert for vert. That way later on we can actually tell it to weld all these points together, so there's no gap in between any of the pieces, and it comes out as if it's a one-piece model at that point. So all these pieces were taken, and then we just export those things out using an OBJ, and I export out the top, the mid, and the bottom. And we've already looked at an earlier video on how to take those pieces and use the Z plugin, the Subtool Master that they have inside of here to do the multi pen, which makes it a little bit easier for getting all those pieces together. So once they're all together and we've got these three pieces, we need to actually merge these things down to make one model. So I'm going to take the top piece, go to the subtools section, say merge, and I'm going to say merge down. I'm going to hit OK. I don't have this weld on. I don't want to weld the points together. And then I'm going to hit merge down one more time to make this all one model like this. So the next thing is we need to get these things into three separate polygroups. So we're going to go to polygroups, open that up, and then we want to say auto group, which auto group will take a look at any island that isn't merged together or isn't vert welded. We'll go ahead and make those into different polygroups. So I actually have forgot to weld these things inside of Maya, these top verts to this here. So that's pretty easy. I was just using this functionality, this auto groups, to get this separate from the top, the mid, and the bottom. So once I've got this made, I can go ahead and say put on my select rectangle, or you can hold down Control and Shift and then click in here to grab that. So I'm going to click on this piece and this piece, show that like this, and then I'm going to say group visible, or I can hit Control W for that. Then I've got my mid piece, and now I'm going to show this and get the inverse of that, and then hit Control W. So now I've got my three different polygroups and it's one piece model. And I'm going to, this isn't like the insert mesh brushes where we need to look down the center of this to grow it out from the normal. Because we're going to be putting this on a curve, it expects us to be looking at this as if this is the bottom and then this is the top, and so we're looking at it from more of a side view like this. So now if we tap B, we'll go and say create mesh, create insert mesh like this, like we did before, and we'll say new. So you can see if we click and drag this thing out, we've got the old behavior that we had, and it looks kind of weird. Looks like it's not going to work for us. But here's what we need to do. We need to, I'm going to hide some of these things and just get us back to the tool. and show you the pieces that we need to change this. We're going to go to stroke and we're going to dock that. And under the curve section, we're going to turn on curve mode for this. And we're going to turn on bend curve. We also have a snap, which means it's going to snap to a surface if we draw the curve. So with turning those on, here's the functionality that we have. So we've got this to where it's in this curve mode, it's starting to draw this thing out and starting to look cool, but obviously we've got some problems here where it's not bending this piece and these are not welded together. Something else to note, our draw size matters for whenever we drag this thing out on the curve. So depending on what your draw size is, that cable is going to be that size of your brush. Now after you make the curve, no big deal, you can just tap S, drag your brush size larger if you want to make it larger, and then just click on the curve again and it redraws it for you. The other thing to note is we've got our normal red cursor, but if we hover our cursor over the curve itself, we get a new blue cursor that can be a different size than what we're working on before. So if we tap S while it's blue, we can make that brush size smaller, and then at that point you're doing really fine finesse kind of moving to this curve at that point. But if you want to do large sweeping changes to the curve, just tap S while it's blue and make it really large, and you can see you can drag around a larger part of the brush or that curve at that point. And then if you want to change the overall size at any point, you can just tap S and when your cursor is red, and then just click on that and redraw that out. Okay, so let's figure out how to get this thing to weld up for us on here. So I'm going to go up to the brush palette modifier and click that, and click this little thing to dock this over here. And then we're going to look at modifiers. So I'm going to open up modifiers on here, and you can see our brush is seen as a triparts brush, and that's good. Now we're going to tell it to weld the points. So we'll go ahead and click on that, and you can see it's going to weld the points together, but it looks a little bit chunky still as it goes around. So we can tell it to stretch, and you can see how it's going to stretch along here. The other thing we can do is tell it to change the curve resolution. So right now this resolution is a little bit chunky. You can see this kind of angular stuff going on here. So if we drag that up, we can see if we click on that, it really kind of starts to make this thing look nice and smooth. So after you draw it out, you can go ahead and click and drag on the curve like this. But let's say we want to hold part of the position on this. So you can see if we start dragging this, it drags the whole curve. If we drag in the middle, it drags that first part and the second part. So if we go back to that area in the stroke and go under curve, there is a lock start and the lock end. So let's do the lock end and click and drag this. You can see it's going to lock the end part of that. You can still move it around if you click that end point, but let's say we want to have it feel like it's inserting off this thing right here like that. Now that we've held that, we can click and drag this curve around, and we can start to manipulate it, and we don't have to worry about that thing moving on us. So let's say we get this someplace on the model and we're kind of happy with the insertion of that. We can lock the start as well, and now if we click and drag the curve out, it's going to lock both those pieces. The other thing is I'm going to kind of mess this curve up quite a bit like this. And then we're going to go to curve function and open that up, and we can smooth this. You can see there's a smooth value for the curve. This thing's got an open circle and a closed circle version. If you remember, the closed circle version is not quite as intense, so we could smooth that thing out like that, and you won't see the model update until you just click back on that piece and you can see it update. But if we really smooth this out quite a bit and then click just once, I'm going to hit undo real quick, just tap on it, and then we can start to move that thing around. Maybe if I use my mouse, because I don't know if I'm just clicking on that thing too hard or not. So I just want to drag it just a little bit and it'll redraw that thing for us. And I'll smooth out that curve quite a bit more, and then just click. And I think it might be getting this weird kind of elastic effect to it because I was holding the front and the back of the curve. So I'm just going to try to get these reset just a little bit into the model. And then I'll mess up the curve. We'll smooth it out. Instead of pulling on this part of the curve, I think I'm just going to click on one of these sections here. And boy, that's really twisting this part of the model pretty bad right there. So you're going to have to kind of experiment with this. I haven't got perfect results using this, but I can get myself probably about 90 to 95% of the way there with kind of getting this thing shored up. So, I mean, we've got this smoothing functionality. We can lock the start and the end just to kind of get it held there. Then we can turn that functionality off. Another thing that could be having an effect on us is this whole snap thing. If that snap's turned on, it's always trying to snap to the surface as well. So you'll kind of have to play around with some of the options to get really finessed kind of movement if you're looking for that. So I'm just going to pull that out just a little bit more. And then if you're happy with this, you can just click on the surface and you see it takes away that curve. And now you're free to draw another version of this if you want to drag that out like that. Okay, so the other thing is, let's turn on the polyframe. After you drag out that version of it, you will have this version here that you could put on the move brush, and you could start to tweak that a little bit more too. So I think it's just a combination of getting some of the right options on here and then pulling that out correctly. Then we also have, it looks like we could isolate just this part of the model, the middle part, and if it's a little wobbly, you could probably just kind of lightly tap on it with smoothing, but just be a little careful on that, it is possible that you could reduce the overall size of that. Like if I hold down shift and draw that out, I'm really kind of thinning up that tube quite a bit. So there's quite a few different options for you with this this kind of setup to get you what you want for the options for this. The other thing that I kind of want to show you real quick before we're done with this whole thing is how we can push this this curve around a specific shape on something. So let me show you what I'm talking about here. I'm going to go to a polysphere like this. I'm going to drop it down a little bit, and I'm going to get rid of the subdivision levels. So I'm going to delete higher for this. We've already looked at the slice curve brush. I'm just going to slice through this model, and then I'm going to get rid of the top part of it like this. And I'm going to delete hidden. So again, I'm just using my custom interface for a lot of these things because it really kind of speeds things up, but you're going to have to build this interface to your liking. Now I can go to my stroke palette, and there's a curve function under here, and I can tell it to frame the mesh. So we could either frame mesh by polygroups. So let's do another slice curve on this like this. So if we put it on polygroups and say frame mesh, you can see it's going to give us a curve in between the polygroups like this. If we did border, it's just going to give us one for the open border on this. If we had this isolated and we go to the geometry section and we go to creasing and we say crease, we've built up a crease edge on this. So if we hit Control D to add subdivision levels, it's going to crease that part. Now the model's not so great, so I'm going to use the polish by feature on here to polish up the model like that, and it's going to give us a nice crisp edge. But the thing I wanted to show you is that if we go up here to this frame mesh, we can do the creased edges this time, and you can see it's going to give us this nice stroke along this portion of the model. So there's different methods of building up these stroke types, and we can do it from either the border of the model, or we can do it from polygroups or these creased edges. So they're giving you a lot of different options on this. I'm going to use the border, and you can do the frame mesh, and you could do them all at the same time if you wish. So once I have that stroke made, I'm just going to go to B and then go to my insert mesh brush that we just made, and you can just take your brush size, make it the right size that you're looking for, and I'm just going to click on it once, and you can see it's going to draw that model of ours, and it's going to make it along that curve. So you can be really accurate with this method. So you saw me kind of struggle with trying to place this thing exactly where I want it to be. I've found for myself that if I make a sphere and kind of push and pull that thing around to the right shape that I want, and then I build this stroke, and then I build the insert mesh coming off of that, I can just hide this thing when I'm done and say delete hidden, and then now I've got a very specific shape that I've made from that curve. The other thing is if you want to get rid of this curve, you can see under curve function under stroke, you can delete the curve, and then you're just left with this piece of this model. So that's the way that I've found to be really accurate about things, and how you can place certain models within a certain arc that you're kind of looking for. And I can kind of visualize things a little bit better with the geometry, and then building a slice or a polygroup that's going to tell me how that stroke is going to go.